December 1944. Deep in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the world's bloodiest conflict was entering its final desperate winter. Snow fell silently over shattered trees and burned-out vehicles. From a distance came the low rumble of engines, German tanks pushing west in one last furious counterattack. For the Americans caught in their path, this was hell on earth. Outnumbered, outgunned and freezing to death in makeshift foxholes, they faced an enemy that refused to surrender. And yet, something extraordinary was about to happen. As German officers advanced through the smoldering ruins of a Belgian village, expecting easy victory, they suddenly stopped dead in disbelief. What they saw next, what those young American soldiers did, defied every rule of war, every expectation of fear or surrender. It wasn't just courage, it was insanity mixed with defiance, the kind of moment that turned the tide of history. This is the forgotten story of the 101st Infantry, of men who refused to die quietly, of a handful of soldiers who took the impossible and made it real, not with numbers or technology, but with grit, heart, and unshakable brotherhood. This is what made the German officers stare in shock. As the smoke cleared over the frozen battlefield, snow fell like ash from a dead sky. The wind cut through the trees with a whisper that sounded almost human. A faint cry carried through the vast, frozen expanse of the Ardennes. It was December 1944, and the world's bloodiest war had entered its final brutal chapter. The Battle of the Bulge was underway, Hitler's last desperate gamble, to split the Allied forces in two and crush them before they could enter Germany. For the men of the US Army, it was a nightmare. The forest that had once been peaceful was now littered with twisted metal and broken lives. Smoke hung low over the snow, and every sound, every creak of a branch, every crunch of a boot made the soldiers flinch. The 101st Infantry had been stretched thin, holding a line that barely existed. They were exhausted, cold, and starving. Their rifles were half frozen, their hands raw from the cold, and morale had sunk into a silence that said more than words ever could. Sergeant David "Red" Mallory pressed his back against the icy wall of a ruined farmhouse. His breath fogged in the frigid air as he studied a battered map under the weak glow of a candle stub. Around him sat 12 men, what was left of a platoon that had once been 40 strong. Some were asleep, their faces pale and sunken. Others sat in silence, staring into nothing. They had been cut off from the main line 3 days ago, their radio destroyed by shell fire. No orders, no supplies, just the sound of distant artillery echoing through the forest, getting closer with every passing hour. "Any word from command?" whispered Private Lyle, his voice barely audible. Mallory shook his head. "No word, no orders. We're on our own." Outside, the crunch of tracks could be heard faintly in the distance, the grinding steel of German panzers moving along the main road. The men froze. Mallory blew out the candle, plunging them into darkness. The sound grew louder, the deep mechanical growl of engines followed by shouted German voices. The enemy was moving west toward Bastogne. Through a gap in the shattered wall, Mallory peered out into the night. He could see the faint silhouettes of German half-tracks passing down the road, their headlights dimmed, their soldiers laughing, confident. They thought they had already won. Something in Mallory snapped at that moment, not in anger but in resolve. "They think we're dead," he muttered. "Let's make sure they remember us." The men turned to him. He wasn't giving an order. He was making a promise. They were cold, hungry, and nearly broken, but none of them disagreed. If they were going to die, they would die fighting. The farmhouse became a fortress that night. The men scavenged through the wreckage, gathering whatever they could find. Broken rifles were repaired with wire and tape. Grenades were checked, ammo counted, every bullet precious. In the corner, Corporal James "Doc" Heller patched up Private Evans' frostbitten hand with rags torn from a tablecloth. The young soldier gritted his teeth but said nothing. No one complained anymore. There was no point. They found a box of abandoned German mines near the barn and began setting traps along the narrow road below. It was risky. One mistake and they'd all be gone. But the men worked quietly, methodically under Mallory's calm direction. The air was so cold that their breath turned to mist and froze on their eyelashes. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once, then fell silent. When they returned inside, Mallory crouched near the window again, watching the horizon. He could see the faint orange flicker of artillery fire lighting up the night sky. Bastogne was under siege. His men were stranded in the middle of it. He knew what it meant. Reinforcements might never come. Private Lyle sat beside him. "You really think we can stop them?" Mallory didn't answer right away. He just looked at the young soldier and gave a tired smile. "No, but we can slow them down." The words weren't heroic, but they carried weight. The others heard them too, and that was enough. They began to check their weapons again, tightening straps, adjusting helmets. They weren't waiting for orders. They were preparing for dawn. That night the temperature dropped to 20 below. The snow piled up against the walls, and the silence was so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The men huddled together for warmth, taking turns on watch. Somewhere far off, a German tank fired a shell and the ground trembled beneath them. Mallory stayed awake, staring into the darkness. He thought of home, of his wife, of the warm kitchen where she'd be cooking, of his little boy who'd just turned 6. He wondered if they'd ever know what happened here, in this nameless patch of woods halfway across the world. He reached into his pocket and felt a small photograph. The corners worn, the image faded. He smiled faintly, then tucked it away again. As dawn crept over the horizon, the first rays of light glinted off the snow-covered wreckage. The men stirred awake, their breath rising like smoke. In the distance, the sound of engines returned. The Germans were coming back. Another convoy, another show of power. Mallory stood, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "This is it," he said quietly. "Get ready." The others nodded, taking their positions around the farmhouse. Machine guns were set in the windows, rifles aimed through cracks in the walls. The air grew still. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the wind. Through the rising fog, the convoy appeared, trucks, armored cars, and a single Panther tank leading the way. The Germans laughed as they rolled past, oblivious to what waited for them. Mallory took a deep breath, raised his hand, and waited for the first vehicle to hit the mine. When it did, the explosion shattered the silence of the forest, echoing for miles. Flames shot into the sky, and the once quiet farmhouse came alive with the thunder of gunfire. The ambush had begun, and though the odds were impossible, the Americans had just made their stand. For the first time in days, Mallory felt something warm in his chest, not the heat of the explosion, but pride. They weren't beaten yet, not by the cold, not by the fear, not by the war. The explosion that shattered the silence was more than just an act of defiance. It was a message. The Germans had entered what they thought was a dead zone, an abandoned stretch of forest left behind by retreating American units. Instead, they had driven straight into a trap. The lead half-track erupted into a fireball, throwing shrapnel and men into the air. Snow and dirt rained down as the sound rolled across the valley like thunder. For a brief moment, time itself seemed to freeze. Then the forest came alive. From inside the wrecked farmhouse, Sergeant Mallory's men unleashed everything they had. Rifles cracked in rapid bursts, the staccato rhythm echoing between the trees. Private Lyle squeezed the trigger of his M1919 machine gun, cutting through the smoke and confusion, his belt of ammunition rattling as hot shells clinked to the floor. "Keep them pinned!" Mallory yelled, his voice hoarse but steady. His men obeyed without question. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not out of spirit. Through the shattered window panes, Mallory could see the chaos unfolding below. German soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting commands, trying to figure out where the attack was coming from. The convoy was trapped. The first truck destroyed, the last one blocked by wreckage on the narrow road. A perfect kill zone. Flames from the burning vehicles cast flickering shadows over the snow, turning the white landscape into a battlefield of fire and steel. Mallory ducked as a burst of return fire shattered the brick beside him. He felt the sting of flying debris against his cheek. Lyle shift fire left. "Johnson, take that MG," he barked, moving through the cramped room as calmly as if he'd been born for moments like this. Despite the fear gnawing at their stomachs, his men followed every order without hesitation. They trusted him. He was their anchor in the storm. Private Evans, the youngest of the group, fumbled with his rifle. His hands were shaking, fingers numb from the cold. Mallory crouched beside him, helping him reload. "Steady, son," he said quietly. "Pick your shots. Don't waste rounds." Evans nodded, swallowing hard before taking aim at a German soldier sprinting for cover. The shot rang out and the figure fell. The boy's breathing steadied. For the first time since the ambush began, Mallory saw something change in his eyes and resolve. The Germans were rallying now. A machine gun opened up from behind one of the trucks, spraying the farmhouse with bullets that tore through the walls like angry hornets. The men hit the floor as plaster rained down from the ceiling. "They're flanking left!" yelled Corporal Heller. Mallory crawled to the window, scanning the tree line. Sure enough, a squad of German infantry was moving through the woods, trying to encircle them. He cursed under his breath. They needed to act fast or be overrun. Grenades! Mallory shouted. Lyle tossed him two. Mallory pulled the pins and lobbed them through the window toward the approaching squad. Two sharp explosions rocked the forest, followed by screams. The attack faltered. For now they were holding, but holding wasn't winning. Their ammunition was running low, and the enemy was regrouping. The Panther tank at the rear of the convoy began to turn its turret toward the farmhouse. The metallic whine of gears cut through the air, a sound that froze every man in place. "Down!" Mallory roared. A split second later, a shell slammed into the side of the building, blowing a hole through the lower wall. The explosion threw Mallory and Heller across the room. Smoke filled the air, thick and suffocating. When the dust cleared, Mallory struggled to his feet, ears ringing, coughing up soot. "Report!" he shouted, his voice raw. One by one, the men responded. A few were bleeding, but none were dead. They had been lucky this time. Outside, the tank's engine roared again, preparing for another shot. "We have to move," Mallory yelled. "They'll bring the whole house down on us." The men grabbed what ammo they could carry and scrambled through the back of the farmhouse, slipping into the snow-covered woods. Behind them, another shell struck, collapsing the front of the building into rubble. Flames licked at the roof as black smoke rose into the gray sky. They ran through the forest, their boots crunching in the snow, lungs burning from the cold and smoke. Mallory led them deeper into the trees, using the terrain for cover. The gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the faint rumble of German engines searching the area. When they finally stopped, the men collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air. Private Lyle broke the silence. "That was insane," he said, still catching his breath. "They've got armor, air cover, and we've got what? 2 machine guns and a miracle." Mallory managed a faint grin. "Then we'll make it count." He crawled up to the ridge and peered through his binoculars. The convoy was a wreck. Several trucks burning, bodies scattered, smoke curling into the cold air. But the Panther was still there, its gun scanning the tree line like a predator hunting prey. German soldiers were fanning out cautiously, checking the forest. They didn't know how many Americans had attacked them, and Mallory intended to keep it that way. He turned back to his men. "We've hurt them worse than they know. They'll be cautious now. That's our chance." "To do what?" Heller asked. Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Finish it." There was silence for a moment, broken only by the wind. The men stared at him, realizing what he meant. He wanted to go back. To hit them again, to take down that tank. It sounded like madness. But in war, madness and bravery often wore the same face. Mallory looked around at his men, frostbitten, bruised, exhausted, and yet every one of them nodded. Not one hesitated. They began to prepare quietly, moving through the snow like ghosts. Each man checked his weapon, counted his remaining rounds, adjusted his helmet. Mallory retrieved 2 captured German grenades from his belt and handed one to Heller. "We hit the tank from the flank," he said, "when they least expect it." Somewhere in the distance, the sound of church bells drifted faintly through the cold morning air, a strange, haunting reminder that Christmas was near. But here in the Ardennes, the only gift to be given was survival. And as the men crept back toward the smoke and fire of the burning convoy, they knew one thing for certain. The Germans might outnumber them, but they would never outfight them. Not while Sergeant Mallory still drew breath. The forest was eerily quiet after the chaos. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful but heavy, like the world itself was holding its breath. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint crackle of the burning convoy below. The air smelled of gunpowder, diesel, and snow. From their new position in the woods, Sergeant Mallory and his men crouched low, watching the enemy movements through the branches. The Germans were furious. Dozens of soldiers moved about frantically, shouting in sharp bursts of anger as they tried to regroup. They had no idea how many Americans had ambushed them, and that uncertainty made them dangerous. Mallory lay on his stomach behind a thick log, his binoculars pressed to his eyes. Through the drifting smoke, He saw the Panther tank's massive turret swing from side to side, searching for targets. Its gun barrel gleamed in the weak daylight, darkened with soot. Nearby, a German officer stood barking orders, his voice cold and clipped. He wore a pristine greatcoat despite the chaos around him, and his every movement spoke of arrogance and frustration. Mallory could almost hear the disbelief in his tone. Disbelief that a handful of American soldiers could wreak this much havoc. Private Lyle crawled up beside him. "They're not leaving," he muttered. "We hit them hard and they're still digging in." Mallory nodded. "They're waiting for reinforcements. They want to clear this sector completely before they move on Bastogne." He lowered the binoculars and turned to his men. "If that tank reaches the road junction, it'll cut off our boys in the south. We can't let that happen." Heller frowned. "With what? We barely got out of that farmhouse alive. We don't have enough ammo to take down a tank." Mallory's eyes shifted toward the smoking wrecks below. "Maybe we don't, but they do." The plan came together in the snow, whispered between men who had already accepted they might not see another sunrise. The Germans had lost supplies in the convoy, ammunition, fuel, even a few rocket launchers. If the Americans could slip close enough, they might grab what they needed. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. As dusk began to settle, the forest grew darker, cloaked in fog. The enemy patrols had pulled back to secure the road, leaving a brief window of opportunity. Mallory motioned to two of his men, Lyle and Evans, and the three of them crept down the hill, moving silently through the snow. Every step was deliberate, every breath slow. The glow of the fires flickered across their faces as they approached the wreckage. The air was thick with smoke and the faint crackle of burning wood and rubber. They reached the edge of the destroyed convoy. Twisted metal lay scattered across the ground. A German soldier's helmet lay half buried in the snow beside a broken rifle. Mallory crouched near the burned-out half-track, scanning the shadows. Somewhere nearby, a wounded German groaned softly, his voice faint and pained. Mallory paused, listening, then motioned for silence. He moved forward, spotting a crate half hidden under debris. It was marked with German writing, Panzerfaust. He opened it carefully. Inside were two shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, intact and ready. He looked back at Lyle, and for the first time in hours, a small grin appeared on his face. "Santa came early," he whispered. They grabbed what they could, a few extra magazines, grenades, and the two Panzerfausts, and began their slow retreat. But as they turned back toward the woods, a flare shot up into the sky behind them, bathing the snow in harsh white light. German voices shouted from the trees. "They'd been spotted! Run!" Mallory hissed. Bullets tore through the air, kicking up snow around them. Evans stumbled, crying out as a round grazed his leg, but Mallory grabbed him by the collar and dragged him onward. Lyle turned and fired a few bursts from his rifle to cover their retreat, the muzzle flashes lighting up his face. They crashed back through the brush, sliding down the embankment and into the shadows of the forest, just as more flares went up. By the time they reached the others, they were breathless and bleeding, but alive. Mallory handed the captured weapons to Heller. "Load them up," he said. "We're taking that tank before dawn." The men stared at him, half in disbelief. They were exhausted, their bodies trembling from cold and adrenaline, but Mallory's tone left no room for doubt. They had survived too much to quit now. They prepared in silence. Heller checked the Panzerfausts, muttering to himself about firing range and backblast. Lyle cleaned his machine gun with numb fingers. Evans, limping but defiant, tightened the bandage around his leg. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, blanketing the earth in white. As the first hints of dawn painted the horizon gray, Mallory led them out once more. The German camp below was quieter now, the men huddled near fires for warmth. The tank sat idle, its engine off, a black silhouette against the smoldering wreckage of the convoy. It looked like a sleeping beast, powerful, invincible, and unaware of the hunters closing in. They crawled through the trees until they were within striking distance. Mallory motioned to Heller, who raised the Panzerfaust, taking aim at the tank's exposed side armor. The cold metal of the launcher bit into his shoulder. "Now or never," Heller whispered. The blast shattered the dawn. The rocket streaked through the air and struck the Panther just behind the turret. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the entire tank erupted in flame, the explosion roaring through the still forest. German soldiers screamed in panic as the massive vehicle turned into a blazing inferno. "Move! Move!" Mallory shouted. They opened fire again, raining bullets on the stunned enemy troops. Confusion spread like wildfire. The Germans fired wildly into the trees, not knowing where the attack was coming from. Another explosion tore through a nearby truck as Heller fired the second Panzerfaust, sending debris flying. By the time the smoke began to clear, the Americans were already gone. Ghosts fading back into the woods, they didn't cheer. There was no triumph in their eyes, only exhaustion and grim satisfaction. They had destroyed the convoy. They had stopped the tank. Against all odds, they had survived. As they retreated deeper into the forest, Mallory looked back once more. The fire reflected in his eyes, the burning wreckage, the chaos, the disbelief on the faces of the German officers who had thought American soldiers were soft. Untested, easy prey, they weren't laughing anymore. By the following morning, the smoke from the destroyed convoy hung over the trees like a dark, haunting fog. The air smelled of burnt oil, frozen mud, and cordite. The forest was still except for the faint crackle of fire and the occasional pop of unexploded ammunition cooking off in the wreckage. Mallory's men had retreated several miles north under cover of darkness, finding refuge in the ruins of an old hunting lodge buried deep in the woods. The structure was barely standing, the roof half collapsed, walls splintered by shellfire, but it offered shelter, and that was enough. The men sat in silence around a dim fire built from broken furniture, warming their hands against the meager flames. Their faces were hollow, eyes bloodshot from exhaustion. Private Evans, his leg bandaged, dozed against the wall. Lyle and Heller were cleaning weapons with quiet focus, the rhythmic scrape of metal on metal, the only sound for several minutes. Mallory sat apart from them, his back against a beam, staring at the snow drifting through a hole in the roof. He hadn't slept. He couldn't. The faces of the men they'd lost still hovered in his mind, ghosts of those who hadn't made it out of the farmhouse, of those left buried beneath the rubble and snow. After a long silence, Heller broke the stillness. "They'll be back for us," he said. His voice was low, grim, but steady. "You hit a German armored column like that and they don't just forget." Mallory nodded slowly. "They'll send patrols through the forest. Maybe even armor support. They'll want revenge. And what do we do when they find us?" Lyle asked. His tone wasn't fearful, just weary. Mallory looked around at his men, their tired faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. "We make sure it costs them more than it's worth." He unfolded a crumpled map and spread it across the dusty floor. It was torn, stained, but still legible. His finger traced a line along the narrow trails winding through the woods. "If we can reach this ridge," he said, pointing to a small elevation south of their position, "we can get a clear view of the main road. Command's push toward Bastogne depends on keeping that road open. If we can relay what's coming through here, we can still help the boys fighting down there." "But how?" Heller asked. "Our radio's still busted." Mallory glanced toward the corner where Evans was sleeping. "Not for long," he said. "Private Evans used to fix radios before the war. If there's a way to get that transmitter working, he'll find it." The men exchanged skeptical looks, but no one argued. They'd seen Mallory pull off the impossible before. If he said it could be done, they believed him. For the next few hours, they worked. Evans limped around the small space, scavenging parts from their gear and the remnants of an old German field set they'd found in the wreckage. He worked by candlelight, fingers trembling from cold but eyes sharp with concentration. The others stood guard outside, scanning the tree line for movement. The wind howled through the pines, carrying distant echoes, the faint rumble of engines, the crunch of boots in the snow. The Germans were out there, sweeping the forest in search of the ghosts who had humiliated them. By mid-afternoon, a spark of static came from the radio. Evans grinned through cracked lips. "I think I've got her," he said. Mallory crouched beside him, adjusting the frequency dials with practiced hands. "This is Able Company, 3rd Platoon," he said into the receiver. "We're behind enemy lines north of Bastogne. We've hit a German convoy. Armor and supply units destroyed. Heavy enemy movement heading west. Request air recon or artillery intercept." For a tense moment, there was only static. Then faintly, a voice crackled through the speaker, tired but clear. "Copy that, Able Company. Hold position. Help is on the way." The men looked at each other in disbelief. For the first time in days, hope flickered in their eyes. Help The word felt almost foreign after so much isolation and fighting. Mallory allowed himself a small smile. "You did good, Evans," he said quietly. "Real good." But their relief didn't last long. Minutes later, the distant sound of engines broke the stillness. It was faint at first, then grew louder, heavier, tracks, tanks. The Germans were sweeping the area closer than before. Mallory's jaw tightened. "Pack up," he ordered. "We're moving out." They doused the fire and grabbed their gear, leaving nothing behind but footprints. The snow had begun to fall again, thick and fast, erasing their trail as they moved. They trudged through the forest in silence, every man alert, every sense tuned to the sounds around them. The snow muffled their footsteps, but it also dulled visibility. The forest felt endless, a maze of shadows and branches that all looked the same. Hours passed. The light began to fade. Then came the sound, a sharp, sudden, unmistakable. The snap of a twig. Mallory froze. He raised a hand, signaling for the others to stop. The forest went silent again, but then they heard it. German voices close, too close. A patrol was moving through the woods, flashlights sweeping the darkness. The Americans dropped flat into the snow, hearts pounding. The light beams flickered past them just feet away. They could see the outlines of helmets, rifles glinting faintly in the dim light. For what felt like eternity, they didn't move. The Germans stopped, speaking in low tones. One of them stepped forward, his boots crunching in the snow, heading straight toward where Mallory lay hidden. The soldier's shadow passed over him. Mallory's hand tightened on his knife. He could see the man's breath in the cold air. Then from behind, a branch cracked somewhere deeper in the forest. The Germans turned instantly, shouting commands, their flashlights jerking toward the sound. Within seconds, they moved off in that direction, the light fading into the trees. Mallory let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They waited 5 more minutes before moving. No one spoke. No one dared. When they finally reached the ridge, the view that opened before them was breathtaking, odd, and horrifying. Below, through the swirling snow, they could see miles of movement. German armor, trucks, and troops stretched along the road like an endless iron serpent. The counter-offensive was massive. Mallory's expression hardened. He handed the binoculars to Heller. "Now you see why we couldn't let that tank reach the junction," he said quietly. "If that convoy breaks through, Bastogne doesn't stand a chance." They had done their part, but it wasn't over. Far from it. The enemy was still advancing, and the American lines were stretched to breaking. As darkness fell again, Mallory turned to his men, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to hold this ridge as long as we can. If they come this way, we stop them, no matter what it takes." In the fading light, their faces were weary but resolute. They were just a handful of men, surrounded and outnumbered in the vast frozen wilderness. But that didn't matter anymore. They had already defied the odds once. They could do it again. And somewhere in the shadows below, a German officer stared at the burning wreckage on the road, shaking his head in disbelief. How had a few American soldiers, half-starved, half-frozen, had done this? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. They weren't fighting ordinary men. They were fighting legends in the making. The night was bitter cold, the kind that bit into skin and turned breath into white clouds in the dark. The ridge had become their last stand, a narrow strip of frozen earth overlooking a snow-covered valley, crawling with German movement. For hours, Mallory and his men had been digging shallow foxholes and reinforcing them with fallen logs, turning the ridge into a rough, defensive line. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. Their rations were almost gone, ammunition running low, and sleep was a distant memory. Yet none of them complained. They knew the Germans were coming. And when they did, the Americans would be ready. At first light, the forest below came alive with movement. Through the mist and drifting snow, the silhouettes of German soldiers appeared. Small at first, like ghosts in the distance, then larger, more defined. They were moving in disciplined formation, rifles at the ready, scanning the tree line ahead. Behind them, the low rumble of engines rolled through the cold air. Half-tracks and armored cars, their treads grinding against the frozen road. The enemy was sweeping the area, hunting for the small group that had caused so much destruction the night before. Mallory crouched behind a fallen tree, binoculars in hand. He counted at least 2 platoons, 60, maybe 70 men with armor support. His men numbered 9, including himself. The odds were impossible, but retreat wasn't an option. They were the only American presence in this part of the forest. If they pulled back, the Germans would move unchecked toward the main road leading to Bastogne. That couldn't happen, not while they were still breathing. He lowered the binoculars and turned to Helle. "They're coming straight for us," he said quietly. "We hold until they're too close to call for artillery. Then we hit them hard and fast." Helle nodded, eyes calm but determined. The others took up their positions along the ridge, rifles aimed, machine guns propped on bipods, grenades lined up like desperate promises. Every man checked his weapon one last time, fingers trembling not from fear but from the cold. The silence before the storm was deafening. Then came the first crack of a rifle. A single shot echoed through the forest, followed by the bark of return fire. The battle had begun. The Germans opened up immediately, their MG-42 machine guns unleashing sheets of fire that tore through branches and kicked up snow around the ridge. Mallory's men ducked low, returning fire in short, controlled bursts. The air was filled with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Bullets snapped through the trees, splintering bark and cutting through the icy air like whips. For every shot the Americans fired, a dozen came back their way, but they held firm. Each burst of fire from their rifles found its mark. A soldier dropping into the snow, another diving for cover. They knew they couldn't match the Germans in numbers, but they could bleed them with precision. Lyle, the youngest of them, manned the Browning machine gun. His face was pale, jaw clenched, eyes fixed down the sights. The heavy weapon roared to life, sending a hail of rounds down the slope, cutting into the advancing line. The German formation staggered, broke, then regrouped under shouted orders. Mortar shells began to land, shaking the ridge with thunderous impacts. Dirt and snow exploded into the air, showering the defenders with debris. A shell hit close enough to throw Mallory backward, ears ringing. But he scrambled up again, brushing the snow from his face and shouting orders over the chaos. "Hold your fire! Wait for them to close in," he yelled. His men obeyed, conserving what little ammunition they had left. Through the smoke, they could see the enemy creeping closer, 50 yards, 30, 20. When the first line of Germans broke cover and charged, Mallory gave the signal. The ridge erupted in flame. Grenades exploded among the attackers, shattering the charge and throwing men to the ground. The Americans fired in controlled bursts, cutting through the confusion. Screams echoed through the trees. The Germans faltered, fell back, regrouped. But they weren't done. Moments later, another wave came, this one heavier, more coordinated, supported by an armored half-track that rolled toward the ridge with its gun blazing. Mallory crawled to the edge of the trench, pulling a satchel charge from his pack. "Cover me!" he shouted. Without waiting for a reply, he sprinted down the slope, snow crunching under his boots. Bullets snapped past him, churning up white powder in his wake. He reached the half-track just as it pivoted its turret toward the ridge. With a single motion, he pulled the pin and tossed the charge under the vehicle's belly before diving into the snow. The explosion lit up the valley like lightning. The half-track lifted off the ground, its steel hull torn apart by fire and shrapnel. The blast threw German soldiers backward, their shouts drowned out by the roar. Mallory rolled over, gasping for air, ears ringing. He could feel the heat from the burning wreck, even through the cold. From above, his men cheered, their morale surging at the sight. The German advance faltered again, but the fight was far from over. Mortar rounds continued to rain down, one landing dangerously close to Evans' position. He was thrown clear, his rifle shattered, his arm bleeding heavily. Helle dragged him back behind the logs, pressing a field dressing against the wound. "Stay with me, Evans!" he shouted, but Evans only groaned, teeth clenched against the pain. The medkit was nearly empty. There was no morphine left. As daylight began to fade, the forest fell eerily quiet. Smoke hung low over the ridge, and the sound of gunfire slowly died away. The Germans were withdrawing, dragging their wounded through the snow. Mallory watched them through the haze, chest heaving, rifle still in his hands. They'd held the ridge, somehow against all odds. The price had been heavy. 2 of his men were dead, another gravely wounded, but they were alive, and the German advance had been stopped, at least for now. When the last echoes of battle faded into the distance, Mallory sank to his knees in the snow, staring at the horizon. The forest was bathed in a dull orange glow from the burning wrecks below. The air was thick with smoke and silence. Hella walked up beside him, face streaked with soot, and said quietly, "They'll be back." Mallory nodded slowly. "Then so will we." In that moment, as the snow continued to fall over the battered ridge, it didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like sacred ground, a place where a handful of men had stood against a tide and refused to break. Somewhere deep in that frozen forest, surrounded by death and darkness, they had proven something to the enemy and to themselves. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were survivors. And as long as one of them could still hold a rifle, the fight wasn't over. When dawn broke over the forest, the world seemed eerily still. Smoke drifted lazily through the trees, mixing with the morning fog and the faint smell of cordite. The ridge, once alive with thunder and chaos, was now a graveyard of silence. Burned-out vehicles smoldered in the valley below, black scars across the white snow. The dead, German and American alike, lay scattered across the frozen earth, their faces pale and still in the cold light. Sergeant Mallory stood at the edge of the ridge, his helmet tucked under one arm, staring at the devastation with hollow eyes. He had seen battle before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a victory, it was survival carved out of desperation. The night's battle had cost them dearly. Evans was gone. 2 others were wounded and barely conscious, their uniforms soaked with blood. Supplies were nearly gone, ammunition spent. Yet as Mallory looked at the horizon, he could see movement far to the east, dark columns snaking across the snow-covered roads. The German army wasn't done. Another offensive was brewing. This ridge was just one small piece of a much larger struggle, one that stretched from the Ardennes all the way back to the Rhine. And the Americans, tired, cold, hungry, were expected to keep holding the line. By mid-morning, a U.S. reconnaissance patrol reached their position. The men came trudging up through the forest, weary and cautious, unsure what they would find. When they finally emerged from the trees and saw Mallory's small band still standing, they stopped in disbelief. "We thought you were all dead," one of them said quietly. Mallory gave a faint, exhausted smile. "We almost were," they laughed. Hoarse, hollow laughter that felt like the first sign of life after a long winter. The recon officer took one look at the smoldering wrecks below and shook his head. "How many did this?" Mallory just replied 9. The man stared for a moment, then simply said, "Hell of a job, Sergeant." Later, as medics tended to the wounded and engineers began clearing the road, word of their stand began to spread. Officers came through inspecting the battlefield, murmuring among themselves in disbelief at what a handful of men had managed to accomplish. A colonel finally approached Mallory, his expression a mix of awe and sadness. "You stopped an entire battalion from breaking through," he said. "If they'd gotten past this ridge, they would have hit the convoy near Bastogne. You saved hundreds of lives." Mallory didn't answer at first. He just stared out at the horizon, his hands trembling slightly from fatigue. "We just did what we had to do, sir," he finally said. The colonel nodded slowly, understanding that some victories were too costly to celebrate. That night, when the rest of the unit finally arrived to relieve them, Mallory and his surviving men sat by a small fire at the edge of the woods. The flames flickered weakly against the cold wind, throwing long shadows across their faces. No one spoke for a long time. They didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged in the crucible of fire and death, something beyond words or medals. Lyle, the youngest, finally broke the silence. "Think they'll tell anyone about this?" he asked quietly. Mallory stared into the flames before replying. "Maybe, maybe not. Doesn't matter. We know what happened. For the men who survived, the battle on that ridge would remain etched in memory long after the war ended. Years later, historians would uncover after-action reports describing how a small American force had held off overwhelming German numbers for nearly 12 hours, destroying multiple vehicles and inflicting heavy casualties. The official record would call it a tactical delay, but for the men who were there, it was something deeper, a moment when courage stood taller than fear, when brotherhood meant everything, and when ordinary soldiers became legends without even realizing it. The Germans, too, would remember that fight. Prisoners captured days later spoke of the Americans who refused to die, who fought like ghosts in the snow. One officer, according to intercepted communications, had called it madness, how 9 men had held off his armored column for so long. He couldn't understand it. The German army, trained in precision and overwhelming force, had met something it couldn't quantify: the will of men who simply refused to give up. When Mallory finally received his orders to pull back, he gathered his remaining men and looked one last time at the ridge. The snow had begun to fall again, covering the scars of battle, softening the hard edges of destruction. It was quiet now, peaceful, almost sacred. He removed his helmet, letting the cold air bite at his skin, and whispered a silent goodbye to those who had fallen there. Then he turned and walked away, leaving behind a piece of himself that would never return home. Years later, when the war was long over and the world had moved on, survivors of that day met again. They were older, slower, but their eyes still carried the same fire. They gathered at a small memorial near the Ardennes, where a simple stone marker stood among the trees. It bore no grand inscription, just a single line. Here they stood. No one needed to say more. They knew what it meant. For Sergeant Mallory and his men, that battle was never about glory or medals. It was about each other, about holding the line when no one else could, about proving that even in the darkest winter of war, courage could still burn brighter than fear. And somewhere, in old reports buried deep in military archives, the German officers who survived would write of it too. They would recall how a small band of Americans had turned their advance into chaos, how they'd fought with reckless resolve. "We thought they were finished," one report said, but they rose from the smoke again and again. They couldn't believe what those American soldiers had done next. But the truth was simple. When cornered, outnumbered, and surrounded, those men had done what Americans throughout the war had always done. They fought. They endured. And they won.